The fire took the foredeck before anyone aboard the Halcyon had finished swearing at it. One moment, Captain Tristan Rourke had been standing at the wheel with the wind off the French coast in his teeth, and the next, a French sloop, 2 cables to leeward, had decided to remind him whose water this was, and a single warning charge from her bow had clipped his powder keg amidships, and the powder keg had answered in the only language powder understood. The deck went orange. The mainsail, which had been the color of old butter in the moonlight, lifted at one corner like a curtain and began to burn from below. Tristan turned the wheel hard down without thinking. He turned it because turning was what a man did at a wheel, and because to do anything else was to stand and watch his ship eat itself, and he was not the standing sort. The wind caught the hewling deck, and a barrel of tar broke its lashings somewhere astern and rolled into the flames. And the flames considered the barrel and accepted the offering. Through the smoke he saw, for one half instant, the passenger. She had paid in coin and in silence. Her name on the manifest was Mrs. Lyle, and the name had fit her about as well as a borrowed coat. She had carried herself, that first dusk in Folkestone Cove, like a woman who had never in her life been a Mrs. of anything, who had stepped into the dinghy as if into a withdrawing room, hooded, gloved, dark bronze travelling silk to her boots, the silk of a woman who had ordered it cut for a London season, and not for a smuggler's cutter at 3 bells in a gale. She had asked no questions. He had asked no questions. The coin was good. Now Mrs. Lyle was on her hands and knees on the burning foredeck, because the explosion had knocked her clean out of the companionway hatch, and the silk skirts of Mrs. Lyle were nearer to the rolling tar barrel than any silk skirt had any business being. "Get back!" Tristan shouted, and let the wheel go. The wheel spun without him. The Halcyon turned her shoulder to the wind, and the wind, ungenerous, leaned harder on the mainsail. He crossed the deck at a run. The boards beneath his boots were hot, and the hot boards smelled of pitch and salt, and the particular acrid sweetness of a ship that had begun, beam by beam, to surrender itself to fire. Smoke poured up through the broken foredeck planking in a thick grey rope. He took it through the lungs, and his lungs answered with a cough that bent him double for one wasted second. The woman was on her knees, one hand flat on the deck, the other still gripping a small carpet bag, as if the carpet bag mattered more than air. Her hood had slipped back. Copper hair, in the orange light, the same color as the burning sail. Her face was streaked. She turned the face up to him, and he saw that her eyes were not panicked. Her eyes were furiously, ferociously calculating the distance between her knees and the rail. "Drop the bag," he said. She did not drop the bag. He bent and put one hand under her elbow and the other flat against her back between her shoulder blades, and he lifted her bodily off the deck. She was lighter than he had been expecting, and she fought him for half a second, the way a cat will fight a basket. And then she stopped fighting, because she had heard the second crack. The foremast, 3 feet above their heads, splitting from the heat. "Now," Tristan said. He carried her. He carried her 4 strides through the smoke to the lee rail. The longboat was already swung out on its falls, because the boatswain, may God reward the boatswain, had cut the gripes the instant the powder went. Tristan reached the rail and bent and dropped the woman over it and into the boat below in one motion. She landed on her side among the oars. The carpet-bag landed beside her. The carpet-bag struck the gunwale and made a sound like coins striking wood, and then like glass cracking inside cloth. And the woman looked at it once, and then up at him through the smoke. "My ship," he said to her, in the most ordinary voice he could manage, "is going to be a great inconvenience to the underwriters. Hold on." He cut the falls. The longboat dropped 4 feet to the sea and slapped the water and bucked, and the woman, Mrs. Lyle, who was not Mrs. Lyle, went down on one knee and clung. Tristan went over the rail after her in a clean drop and landed in the stern. The boatswain was already at the oars. The cook was bailing. The boy Tomkin, who was 12, and the smallest soul Tristan had ever taught to splice a rope, was crammed against the forward thwart with his eyes wide and his mouth shut. Tristan had seen the boy's eyes go that wide once before, in a storm off Brest, and he was glad to see them go that wide again, because eyes wide and mouth shut was the only acceptable arrangement for a boy of 12 aboard a longboat in a burning sea. "Pull!" Tristan said. They pulled. Behind them, the Halcyon, who had been an honest cutter under 3 previous owners, and an honest cutter under him, leaned over and finished what the powder had begun. The flames climbed the mainsail and ate it as if it had been a paper screen. The French sloop, who had not meant ruin and was now standing off to leeward in a confusion of her own, fired no more shots. The woman in the dark bronze silk sat where she had fallen, one palm pressed to the bottom of the boat, the other still wrapped, white-knuckled, around the carpet-bag. She looked across at him over the lifting oars and did not speak. "Mrs. Lyle," Tristan said, drawing breath at last, "you appear to have outlived your passage." His voice, in the longboat under the burning ship, was the voice of a man asking after a parcel. She heard the voice. She heard the absence of fear in it. She heard, under the absence of fear, the carefully controlled exhaustion of a man who had been at the wheel for 9 hours and now, by way of intermission, was conducting a salvage by oars across the channel. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "about the ship." "So am I," he said. "Pull, lads." She looked at him. She looked at him as if he had spoken in a language she half recognized and could not quite place. Then her shoulders went down by an inch, and she let out a breath that had been waiting in her since the powder keg. That was the first thing Captain Tristan Rourke ever said to Helena Vane. It was also, although he had no way of knowing it on that particular night 3 miles off the French coast in March of the year 1814, the first thing any man of his line had said to any woman of hers in 11 years that had not been said through a solicitor. He did not know her name. He did not know that the carpet-bag, when it struck the gunwale, had cracked a small enamelled compass inside a velvet-lined writing case. He did not know whose hand had given her the compass, or whose hand she had stolen it from, or whose hand was, at that very moment, holding the dry quill above the parish register of St. Mary's, Hawksbourne, where she had been entered 10 years ago as the betrothed of one Cassian Daventry, Marquis of Hawksbourne. Entered, that is, in her father's hand, in her 13th year, 3 months after his lordship had taken Vane House to pay her father's debts. None of that, on the night of the longboat off the French coast, was within his know. He knew only that the Halcyon was finished. The longboat was lit by his own burning ship, as bright as a lantern on a stage. The French sloop had withdrawn, and the woman he had pulled off the foredeck had asked, of all things, after his ship. "Steady," he said to her, half over his shoulder, half to the wind. He pulled her cloak straight over her shoulder with one hand, because the cloak had twisted in the falling, and a twisted cloak was a thing he had been raised by his mother to set right. He felt her flinch under the touch, and he felt her decide, in the half-second after the flinch, that he was not the thing she had to be afraid of tonight. He felt the decision, and he understood it, because in his own way, he had made the same kind of decision 100 times in 100 bad weathers. And a man who can read his own face in another person's shoulders is a man who will not be lonely for company at sea. 3 miles, he said to the boatswain. "Make for the cove." The boatswain answered, as boatswains answer the orders of a captain at 3 bells of a middle watch with a ship burning behind them, which is to say, with a single syllable in the affirmative, and his back already turned toward the work. The oars dipped. The water answered. The orange glow on the woman's face deepened and then dimmed, and then deepened again, as the Halcyon's flames climbed the rigging in slow, uneven stages. The boy Tomkin watched the flames over Tristan's shoulder, his small mouth set in the firm, closed line of a boy who has been told once already, in another storm, that crying was for men ashore. Tristan watched the boy. Tristan filed the line of the boy's mouth. The herring gull, somewhere above them in the dark, cried once. They pulled for the cove. The halcyon burned at their backs until she gave a great soft sigh of a sound and broke her own back, and the orange light on the woman's face went out, and there was only moonlight and the smell of the sea, and somewhere above them, very faint, the high cry of a herring gull that should have been asleep at this hour and had been wakened by the fire. She still held the carpet-bag. He still did not know who she was. The cove was a fold in the Sussex chalk no wider than the breadth of the longboat itself, and a man unfamiliar with it would have rowed past 4 times before he saw the seam. Tristan was familiar with it. The boatswain was familiar with it. The cook had taken his ale in the village above it for 19 years. They beached at slack tide on shingle that ground under the keel like a man chewing nuts. The boy Tompkin jumped over first, with the painter in his teeth, and made it fast to a ring of black iron driven into the rock by some patient great-uncle of his own back in the last century. Tristan handed the woman out of the boat. He handed her out because handing women out of boats was one of the 4 or 5 things his mother had taught him before she was gone, and because the woman was, in that moment, plainly unable to climb out unhanded. The dark bronze silk was wet to the knee with seawater, and her right slipper had gone. She placed her bare stockinged foot on the shingle and did not so much as glance at it. She glanced instead at the carpet-bag, which the boatswain had brought ashore behind her, and then she looked up the path that led from the cove into the chalk. "Where are we?" she asked. "In England," Tristan said. The single word was the only word she would have refused that morning of any word in the language, and it was the only word she could decently refuse to receive. She closed her eyes. For 1 whole second, she stood with her eyes closed and her stockinged foot on the shingle and the wet silk against her shins, and Tristan watched her absorb the simple fact that the country she had paid him good money to leave was the country she was standing in. He watched her decide what to do with the information. She opened her eyes. "That," she said, "was not the agreement." "No," Tristan said. "It was not. It also was not, as agreements go, foreseeable. The Halcyon is on the bottom, and the French sloop will report fire on the water before sunrise, and there is not, at this hour, another bottom on this stretch of coast that will take a passenger to France." He paused. "If you have an objection, lodge it with the underwriters." She looked at him. She looked at him as if she were measuring him against some other man, some man who was elsewhere, and then she looked away from him and down at her gloved hand, where the leather of one fingertip had split, and she pressed the split together with her thumb as if pressing a wound shut. "Very well," she said. She was welcome, Tristan said, although she had not thanked him. She begged his pardon. He clarified, for pulling her off the foredeck. She turned her face to him. She held the wet silk of her sleeve in her gloved fingers, as if checking whether it was still her sleeve. She took a long, careful breath of the cold shingle air. The breath was the first whole breath she had taken since the powder keg. She turned her face to him fully. Then, for the first time in good light, the light of the boatswain's lantern, lifted by the cook on a pole, and Tristan saw her properly for the first time. And Tristan understood, in the way one understands the shape of a ship before one has named her, that the woman in front of him was not the wife of a wine merchant, nor the relict of an officer of the line, nor any other plausible Mrs. Lyle. She was 26 years old at the outside. Her face was the kind of face that artists made bad copies of, narrow at the chin, wide at the cheekbone, the mouth set in a line that was not quite anger and not quite weariness, but the precise middle place between the two. Her eyes were grey. Her hair, where the hood fell back, was the colour of copper just out of the smith's water bath, dark, redder than red, and damp. She was beautiful. He noted it the way one notes weather. He was 27 years old. He had been at sea since he was 15. He had hauled ladies' maids and merchants' daughters, and once a French actress out of 3 different boats in his career, and he had a working understanding of what beauty did to the inside of a man's chest. He noted the beauty and set it aside, because the woman had asked, only a moment ago, where she was. "Thank you," Helena said, "for pulling me off the foredeck. It was a busy minute." "You have," she said, "a strange way of receiving thanks." "I have," Tristan said, "a strange way of receiving most things." And then, because she was still standing in the shingle with her wet skirt and her ruined glove and her one stockinged foot, he added, "There is a fisherman's loft 3/4 of a mile up that path. The fisherman is in my employ, and his wife will see to a kettle. After the kettle we shall, if you are willing, have a conversation about who you are." "And if I am not willing?" "Then we shall have the conversation anyway," Tristan said, "and you shall be sour about it." For one instant, he had not been certain he would see it, the corner of her mouth lifted. It lifted only on one side, and only by the width of a sixpence, and it was gone before he had finished registering it. But he had seen it. He had seen her mouth move because of something he had said. He filed the fact away, in the small, careful drawer of his mind, where he kept the things he had earned that day. "Lead on, Captain," she said. "Rourke. Lead on, Captain Rourke." He took the carpet bag from her himself, against her wishes, because her wishes on the subject of the carpet bag were plain and very nearly comical. And he had decided already, in the first moment of carrying her across the burning deck, that he would not negotiate small surrenders out of a woman who had been carried bodily through smoke against her will. She would surrender what she chose, when she chose. The carpet bag was not on the list. They climbed the path. The chalk underfoot was soft in places from the rain of the week before, and firm in others where the sea wind had dried it, and the path zigged once and zagged twice between two banks of gorse that had begun, in the late March of the south coast, to open the first of their yellow flowers. The gorse smelled, faintly, of coconut and pepper, which was a smell Tristan had been raised on at the back of his father's gardens, and had been encountering in narrow strips up cliff paths between Folkestone and Devon for the better part of 20 years. The boatswain followed with the lantern. The boy Tomkin followed with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes on the lady's back, and a face of such open 12-year-old wonder that Tristan made a mental note to tell him in the morning, but staring was an offence under his command. The cook brought up the rear. At the head of the path was a low gate of weathered oak. Beyond the gate, a cottage. Beyond the cottage, fields. Above the fields, in the east, the first thin paleness of a sky that was thinking about morning. Helena stopped at the gate. She put her gloved hand on the top rail. She looked, for a long moment, east, at the paleness, and beyond the paleness, at England. "England," she said softly, to no one in particular. "England," Tristan agreed. "I had thought," she said in the same soft voice, "to see Calais by sunrise." "You shall," Tristan said. "See Calais by sunrise some other sunrise. Come inside." She came inside. Mrs. Penny of the loft was a woman of 61 years and 7 grandchildren, and a particular gift for not asking questions. She put the kettle on. She put a flannel into a basin of hot water. She set out, on a deal table scrubbed white by 4 decades of her own hand, a loaf of bread and a slab of yellow cheese, and a small earthenware pot of honey from her own 3 hives. She laid a clean nightgown over the back of a chair and a pair of dry stockings beside it, and she vanished up her own ladder to her own bed and her own husband, who was asleep, and she pulled the trapdoor shut behind her. The kitchen was lit by the fire in the grate, and 1 tallow candle on the table. Tristan set the carpet bag on the floor by Helena's chair. He set himself, with a deliberation he hoped she would notice, 3 feet farther away than was companionable. He poured tea. He pushed bread across the table. He took off his seacoat and hung it on the peg, and stood in his shirt and waistcoat by the fire, and waited. "You are not," Helena said, "going to ask?" "I am going to ask," Tristan said. "In a minute, After the tea. Why after the tea? Because, he said, you cannot bully the truth out of a person who is cold. A cold person will agree to anything to be let alone. A warmer person will, on occasion, choose to be honest. It is a small distinction, and entirely a question of charity. She looked into her cup. I am Helena Vane, she said. The name passed through him without striking any particular thing. He repeated it in his own head. Vane, Vane, the Vey. And then it struck. He felt it strike against the inside of his ribs, like a thrown stone striking a hull. And for a moment, he could not be certain whether what he felt was recognition, or only the imprint of a name shaped in his ear, like another name. Vane, he said. Vane of Hampshire. Yes. The Viscount. Yes. You are, he said very evenly, the Viscount Vane's daughter. I am the Viscount Vane's only living daughter, Helena said. And as of... She glanced at the small dark window of Mrs. Penny's kitchen, where a square of paleness was widening over the eastern fields. As of Thursday morning, which I believe is today, I am the betrothed wife, by deed and by my father's signature, not mine, of the Marquis of Hawksbourne. Tristan set the teapot down very carefully on the corner of the deal table. Lord Daventry, he said. She confirmed it. He named the man in full, Cassian Daventry, as if testing the consonants against the inside of his teeth. Cassian Daventry, she repeated, and looked at him, and her face was as composed as it had been on the shingle. If the name was known to him, Captain Rourke, she would be glad of the information. The name was known to him. The name was very particularly known to him. The name had, 11 years ago, sat in his father's library in a stack of papers an inch thick. Bills of cost, deeds of transfer, the careful, patient written withdrawal of one estate from the Rourke family by the elegant hand of one Marquis of Hawksbourne, Cassian Daventry's father, the late Marquis. And below the papers, a folded note in the same hand that read, Inform Mr. Rourke that his application for a further extension cannot be entertained. His father had read the note, and his father had set the note down on the desk, and his father, who was a temperate man and not a young one, had walked out of the library and into the orchard, and had stood under an apple tree in the wet, and had not come back inside that night, and had not been the same man after. That was 11 years ago. Cassian Daventry's father had been laid in his vault 4 years after taking the orchard. Cassian Daventry had been 23 at the time, and Tristan had heard, since, that the son was colder than the father and more thorough. Tristan did not say any of this. He poured himself a cup of tea he did not want. He set the cup down. The name, he said, is known to me. Ah. He observed that she was fleeing him. She corrected the observation in her own quiet voice, without the smallest impatience. She was fleeing the contract he held over her father's signature. The Marquis himself she had met 4 times in 10 years, and on none of those occasions had the meeting altered her opinion of the contract. The contract had been signed when she was 13. She was 26. She had, she said, with a small, precise hardness, spent a number of years arranging her objection. And the arrangement, Tristan said, was a passage to Calais on the cutter Halcyon, under the name Mrs. Lyle, which I would be obliged to know was not in the agreement. It was not. My ship is at the bottom of the channel, Lady Helena. Yes. Your husband-to-be, Tristan said, is the son of the man who took my family's estate to settle a debt that, in my late father's opinion at least, was inflated. I do not, as a rule, do business with persons who do business with the House of Hawksbourne. I would not, had I known your name on the manifest, have taken your coin. You will think this very small of me. It is, perhaps, very small of me. It is, however, the truth. She listened to this, with her hands flat on the table. "Captain Rourke," she said, when he had finished, "are you telling me that I have, by an accident of weather and gunfire, paid my passage to be rescued from the foredeck of my enemy's enemy?" "I am telling you," Tristan said, "that I am no friend to the man you are running from. Which is, by the strange charity of circumstance, the most convenient news you have had this week." The corner of her mouth moved again. "It is," she said, "at that." He looked at her across the deal table. The candle was burning down on its iron stick. The bread was uneaten. The cheese was uncut. The honey was unopened. Outside, the sky over the fields had begun to emit, very faintly, the color of a peach. He thought, looking at her, that she was the most awake woman he had ever met at 5 o'clock in the morning, and the most contained. He thought, looking at her, that she had not yet permitted herself the luxury of being frightened. "Eat the bread," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "Eat the bread. There is a long day in front of you and a longer night, and Mrs. Penny will be insulted in the morning if her bread is on the table at breakfast." Helena Vane looked at the bread. She picked up the loaf and tore a piece off the end with her hands, and she ate it slowly, holding the piece in both palms like a thing she was not certain was hers. And Tristan Rourke, 27 years of age, master of a sunken cutter and inheritor of nothing in particular, watched her eat, and felt the small, careful drawer of his mind open of its own accord. And he placed inside it the second thing he had earned of her that night, which was that she had taken the bread when he had asked her to. She was the most dangerous passenger he had ever pulled out of a fire. He poured her another cup of tea. The candle on the deal table guttered once and steadied. Outside, a fox crossed the lane in the half-light, very particular about where she set her paws. The fields above the cottage went on their slow business of admitting morning by the inch. In the room above the kitchen, in the small hour before dawn, Helena slept by stages, 15 minutes at a stretch, then waking, then 10 minutes, then waking. Each time she came back into herself, she catalogued the room by sound. The small settling tick of the deal beams as the cottage warmed under its slate roof, the soft churring of a chaffinch on the eaves, the faint whicker of the chestnut mare in the stable below, the breath of the woman she had until last night believed herself to be growing softer in her chest by quarter-hour increments, as that woman dissolved. She had been Mrs. Lyle for 11 days. She had been the Marquis of Hawksbourne's contracted bride for 11 years. She had been Helena Vane for 26. The catalogue, by the time the eastern square of paleness in the window had become a square of pale gold, came out 3-1 in favour of Helena Vane. She got up. She found her stockings drying on the back of the chair. She drew them on. She drew on the borrowed black wool dress Mrs. Penny had laid out, and the borrowed cap and the borrowed shawl, and she came downstairs. And she was, by any reasonable definition of the word, herself again. Older by a fire, lighter by a contract, the same weight on the same 2 feet on Mrs. Penny's scrubbed kitchen floor. The first 3 days she scarcely spoke. She slept in the room above the kitchen on a horsehair mattress under a blue quilt that Mrs. Penny had quilted herself. She woke at 6 and ate what was set in front of her and walked for an hour in the lower meadow behind the cottage. She returned. She read, when Tristan put a book in her hand, with the focused attention of a woman who had not been left alone with a book in some considerable time. She did not speak of her father. She did not speak of the Marquess. She did not speak of the carpet-bag, which sat in the corner of the room above the kitchen, with its broken clasp retied in twine. Tristan, for his part, ran his small establishment by daylight, which is to say he answered 3 letters from the underwriters, by way of the post-rider at Luce, sent the boatswain inland with a quiet word for the families of the cook and the boy, and rode his own horse, a chestnut mare named Cole, who had been bred for endurance and not for speed, to a turnpike inn 14 miles up the coast, where, at a back table he had used for the purpose 3 times before, he heard the news. The news was as follows. The Marquis of Hawksbourne, having been informed by his lordship's own express on the morning of Thursday last that his betrothed had failed to present herself at the chapel of St. Mary's, Hawksbourne, at the appointed hour of 11 o'clock, was come down from London by post-chaise, and was at present at his hunting box on the South Downs, 8 miles west of where Tristan was sitting. The Marquis had with him 4 men. The Marquis had ridden, the day before, to within a mile of Folkestone Cove and back. The Marquis was, by the report of an ostler who had taken his lordship's mare, in a cold and unrelenting temper. The Marquis had let it be known, in the careful, periphrastic manner of men who know they cannot offer a public reward without admitting a private absconding, that an item of his property had been mislaid in the vicinity, and that the gentleman who restored it should not find his lordship ungenerous. Tristan paid for his ale and rode back along the coast road in the dusk, and did not push the mare. He found Helena in the lower meadow. She was standing by the stile that gave on to the lane, in a black wool cloak Mrs. Penny had pressed on her in lieu of her ruined silk, and her copper hair was bound up plainly under a cap, and she had the carpet-bag at her feet. And Tristan understood without dismounting that she had been waiting for him to come back, so that she might tell him she was going. He dismounted. He led the mare to the gate. He tied the mare to the gatepost. He climbed the stile from his side. He stopped 2 paces from her. "He is at the hunting box," he said. "I had supposed he would be." "He has 4 men." "I had supposed that also." "He is offering," Tristan said, "a private inducement for the return of his property." She was very still. "His property," she said. "I quote, Lady Helena. I do not subscribe." "No, I know." She looked down at her own gloved hands. She drew off the right glove and put it in the pocket of the cloak. She drew off the left. She put it in the other pocket. She looked up at him. "I cannot impose on Mrs. Penny another night. I cannot impose on you another hour. I have a cousin in Bath who will, if she chooses to remember the connection, conceal me until—" "You have no cousin in Bath." "I beg your pardon?" "You have," Tristan said, "a great-aunt by marriage, dowager, with a house off Royal Crescent. Her name is Lady Pendarves. She has not received your father's family at her house in 9 years, and she would, were you to present yourself in your own travelling silk at her door at this present moment, send you back to Hawksbourne in her own carriage with a note of apology pinned to your bodice. I make it my business to know who lives where. The boatswain is from Bath." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is true," she said, "about Lady Pendarves." "I know it is." "Then I have," Helena said slowly, "no cousin in Bath." "None whatever." She picked up the carpet-bag. She set it down. She closed her eyes. "What," she said, "do you propose, Captain Rourke?" "I propose," Tristan said, "that we eat Mrs. Penny's supper. I propose that we sit by Mrs. Penny's fire. I propose that you do me the courtesy of telling me, while we sit, what your enemy will do on the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. For I have made some study of the family Daventry, and I have a working notion. But you have known him from a girl, and you know more. I propose that, between us, we contrive an arrangement that places you somewhere out of reach of him and his 4 men. I propose," he said, "that we begin to think. You owe me no such labour, Captain Rourke." "I owe Mrs. Penny," Tristan said, "the price of a supper. I owe Tomkin a story. I owe my late ship a wake. I do not, as it happens, owe Cassian Daventry the consideration of allowing his property." He set the word on the air with 2 fingers, the way another man would set down a card. "To walk out of my gate into his road." She looked at him. "You are using me," she said quietly, "to settle a private account." "I am declining," Tristan said, "to settle his." He held her gaze. "You may call that what you like." She let out, very slowly, a breath he had not known she had been holding. "I shall call it," she said, "supper." They ate supper. She told him, between the soup and the pudding, in the small, careful voice of a woman who had been waiting 11 years to tell anyone, what Cassian Daventry would do. She told him that he would post a man at every port from Dover to Plymouth. She told him that he would send a private letter to her father, which would, by Sunday at the latest, produce her father at Hawksbourne in tears. She told him that he would, on no account whatever, ride out personally past the boundary of his own lands until he had located her, but that once located, he would come for her himself, in his own person, in his own carriage, because the contract was his, and the breach was his, and he was a man who held his own scaffolding, even when the scaffolding bit him. "He is," Tristan said, "a methodical sort. He is the most methodical man I have ever met." "That is a particular kind of advantage." "It is the only advantage of him I have ever found," Helena said, "in 11 years. Tristan put his spoon down. He had been wanting, for 2 days, to put his spoon down and ask her a thing, and the supper had brought him within reach of asking it, and he asked it now. "Lady Helena," he said, "forgive the question. Did your father read the contract before he signed it?" She did not answer immediately. "My father," she said, "is a kind man. My father is a clever man. My father is the worst man with a deck of cards I have ever known, and the second worst with a glass of port. When the Marquis's father came to him with a deed and a quill, my father had been at the cards in another man's library for 16 hours, and was, by his own later account, perfectly sober, and entirely unable to read the deed." "Ah. He read it the next morning," she said. He was very much himself the next morning. He came into my schoolroom. I was seated at a writing table with my governess. He took the chalk from my hand. He sat down opposite me in the small chair. He held the chalk in his fingers. He said, 'Helena, I have done a very foolish thing.' And then he wept. I was 13. Tristan did not speak. "I've spent," Helena said, "a great deal of time, since, in attempting not to despise him for that quarter of an hour." "It was not the weeping," Tristan said, "you despised." "No." "It was the chalk." She looked at him sharply. "He should not," she said, "have taken the chalk from my hand." "No." "He should have come into the schoolroom," she said, "without the chalk." "He should have." She looked into her plate. She picked up her spoon. She set it down again. "I have not told that," she said, "in 11 years to any soul." "I have heard," Tristan said quietly, "worse confessions over worse soup. Eat your supper, Lady Helena." She ate her supper. The carpet-bag stayed on the bench by the kitchen door. Tristan did not touch it. Helena did not open it. The broken clasp, retied in Mrs. Penny's twine, dangled. On the 5th day, a man rode past the cottage at noon. The day was a Monday. The wind was from the south. The hedge along the lane was full of nesting linnets, and the linnets were all of them noisily occupied with the business of nesting, and were no help at all in concealing anything else moving along the lane. He rode past at a walk. He was not in the Hawksbourne livery, and he was not wearing the buff coat of a magistrate's clerk, but he was a man on a fair-sized bay horse with a saddle that had not been bought at any country fair, and he rode past at a walk that was, to Tristan's eye, watching from behind Mrs. Penny's currant bush, a particular kind of walk, the walk of a man learning a road. Tristan watched him out of sight. He went into the kitchen. He took down the small powder flask from the chimney-piece, which was Mrs. Penny's husband's, and had been used for 40 years to scatter ash on a slug, and he set it back. He took down, instead, an old chart of the coast and a stub of pencil. He spread the chart on the deal table. Helena, who had been mending the hem of the borrowed cloak, set the cloak aside and came to the table. She asked what he was. "A scout," Tristan said. The word fell on Mrs. Penny's deal table, in the kitchen of Mrs. Penny's cottage, the way a stone falls into the still water of a pond. Once, and then in widening circles. She asked whether the scout had been the Marquis's. "His lordship's," he answered, "or some other man who found the same things interesting. The road was a road. The horseman might have been merely a man on a horse. He should, however, he said, be obliged if she would not walk in the lower meadow that day." She agreed. "Lady Helena." "Yes?" "We have," Tristan said, "perhaps 2 days more in this cottage, perhaps 3. If the man on the bay horse was a scout, and he learned this lane today, his lordship will have men on it the day after tomorrow at the latest. I think we should consider where you are to be on Thursday." "Where do you propose I be?" He put his thumb on the chart. "Here," he said. She bent over the table. Her copper hair was very near his shoulder. He smelled, faintly, the soap of Mrs. Penny's washing stand on her skin, and underneath the soap, a thinner, darker note he could not at once identify, and then realized was the salt of the channel that had taken 3 days to leave her hair. "Lime," she read aloud. "Lime," he confirmed. "The next port west, where he had a friend with a bottom that floats." The friend, he said, was a Mrs. Charters who kept the chandlery on the Cobb and had been a widow these 8 years, and ran a small business in moving inconvenient persons very quietly between Lyme and Guernsey. She owed him a favour from a matter at sea he should not trouble Helena with. She would, if he asked her, take Helena off the Cobb in a Guernsey lugger before Saturday. "Guernsey," Helena repeated. Guernsey, he said, was in the Crown's gift, not in the Marquis's. Guernsey was a place from which one might proceed, at one's own pace and under one's own choice of name, to St. Malo, to Granville, to wherever, in fact, one wished to proceed. Guernsey would not extradite a contract dispute. Guernsey would not extradite any number of things. Helena straightened. "And in the meantime," she said, "I am, what? To ride 140 miles to Lyme through the South Downs in a black cloak with a copper-haired head in it, while the Marquis's scouts learn each road in turn. You are to ride 140 miles to Lyme through the Weald and the New Forest in a black cloak with a copper-haired head dyed 2 shades darker by Mrs. Penny's walnut stain, in a country gig driven by a man who is, by reasonable inspection, not the Marquis of Hawksbourne, and not a member of his lordship's household. With," Tristan added, "a brace of pistols in the rumble in case of inconvenience." "By a man," Helena said. "By me." She set her hand on the edge of the table. "You will drive me to Lyme." "I will drive you to Lyme." "That is," she said, 4 days on the road." 5 in a country gig. "Captain Rourke." "Lady Helena." "You will be 5 days in a gig with a woman who is not your wife." He looked at her. She was 26 years old, 6 and 20, the same age as the youngest of the Penny grandchildren's mothers, and she was speaking with the formal precision of a girl of 14 reciting a catechism. He understood, all at once, that she had not been asked to consider the matter from this particular angle in any of the 11 years preceding, because in 11 years the matter of her reputation had been managed entirely by other people, and chiefly by her father's signature, and the consideration of her reputation as a thing that she herself might wish to preserve or to spend was a new and not entirely welcome consideration. "Lady Helena," he said, "I am a sea captain. I am not an officer of the line. I am not a baronet. I am not a man whose company, in a country gig over 5 days, will improve your reputation in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. I am, however, he said, a man who has been 5 days in worse weather, with worse company, and produced no inconvenience to the company at the end of it. I shall, he said, behave myself. That is not, she said, what I was asking. No, he said, I know. I am answering the question I should be answering instead. She looked at him. She looked at him for what felt to him, although he was a man who could time a watch by counting his own pulse, like a full, slow minute. And then her eyes went past him to the chart on the table, and back to him, and she said, Captain Rourke, I have, she said, no reputation that can be further damaged by 5 days in a country gig, because the contract that has hung over my head since I was 13 would, by the lights of the world, swallow any subsequent infraction. The Marquis of Hawksbourne owns my reputation. I am attempting, she said, to acquire a life. You may drive me to Lyme. I should be obliged. Thank you, he said. You are welcome, Captain Rourke. He folded the chart. That night, Mrs. Penny dyed Helena Vane's copper hair 2 shades darker with walnut and chamomile in a basin in the kitchen, and Helena sat on a stool in her stockinged feet with a towel about her shoulders and let the woman work the dye through with patient brown fingers. And Tristan watched from the doorway for the space of 3 breaths, and then went out to the stable, because the sight of a woman having her hair done at a kitchen stool by lantern light was the sort of sight a man kept hold of without intending to, and he had decided already that he would not be holding any such sight at all. He saddled the mare for the morning. He came back into the kitchen at midnight. Helena was still at the table. The basin had been carried away. The lantern was at her elbow. The carpet bag was open at her feet, and on the table in front of her was a small enamelled compass with a hairline crack across the face, and a folded letter, and a small velvet writing case, and a pair of pearl earrings, and a folded, pressed flat embroidery in a hoop. And her own face was, for the first time since he had pulled her off the foredeck, simply tired. I broke it, she said, without looking up. The compass. It was my mother's. He came across to the table. He sat down opposite her. He did not touch the compass. He looked at it, the small brass casing scratched at one edge, the white enamelled face beneath the glass, crossed by one fine dark line, as if a hair had been laid across the rim. It still finds north, he said. It does. That is the function of a compass. It is, Captain Rourke, the function of a compass. Then I shall, he said, decline to call it broken. She lifted her face. Her cheeks were a little pink from the walnut steam. Her hair, where the lantern caught it, was darker by 2 shades, bronze now, where it had been copper. Her grey eyes were unreadable to him in that light. Captain Rourke, she said. Yes. You are a strange man. I have, Tristan said, been so informed by several persons of my acquaintance. The corner of her mouth lifted again, that same half-inch he had earned out of her in the longboat, and this time he allowed himself to watch it. My mother, she said, carried this compass from Lisbon when she was a girl. Her father was a wine merchant. She married very far above her station, which was the great pride of his life, and the slow undoing of hers. I've carried it since I was 9. When I left Hawksbourne House on Wednesday night, I took 3 things from my own room: the compass, the writing case, the earrings, and I left, in the bottom of my wardrobe, every gown his lordship has had made for me in 10 years. That is good housekeeping. It is what I had. He spoke her name with the small, careful attention a sailor spends on the trim of his foresail. She raised her head. He told her, in the steadiest voice he could manage, that what she had was enough. She looked at him. She closed the carpet bag. In the morning, they set off for Lyme. The country gig was a small, two-wheeled trap Mrs. Penny's brother-in-law had kept for the carrying of pigs to market, repainted in modest dark green by Tristan that same morning, with a brush borrowed from the stable. Tristan wore the brown coat of an undistinguished gentleman of business, a horse-coper, an estate agent, a small living parson on his way to a visit, and Helena wore the black wool of a respectable widow on a journey of mild necessity, with her newly walnut-darkened hair under a plain straw bonnet, and a small portmanteau on the floor of the trap, containing the carpet-bag's contents repacked. The carpet-bag itself was burnt the night before in Mrs. Penny's grate, because a Hawksbourne man with an eye for monogrammed leather would have known the carpet-bag by sight. They drove out of the lane at 6 in the morning. By 8, they were on the chalk above Alfriston. By 10, they were skirting Lewes. By noon, they had stopped at a hedgerow for bread and cheese, and Tristan was on his second slice of cheese, and Helena was watching him eat with what he took, with some surprise, to be entertainment. "What?" he said. "You eat," she said, "as if cheese were going out of fashion." "Cheese," Tristan said, "has been going out of fashion at sea for 16 years. I have a great deal to make up. Do you ride?" "I have ridden since I was 4. Why do you ask?" "Because in the unlikely event that the gig comes to an inconvenient halt in the next 2 hours, we shall be obliged, you and I, to mount the mare double, and I should be obliged to know that you can hold a horse at a canter and not fall off." "I shall," Helena said, "not fall off." "Good." "Is that," she said, "a likely contingency?" "In the next 2 hours? No. Tomorrow? Possibly. Thursday? Likely." "Thursday." "Thursday," Tristan said, "is the day his lordship is reasonably expected to have a man at Wickham." "You have planned," Helena said, "for Thursday." "I have planned for Tuesday through Saturday inclusive. Sunday I have not yet planned. We shall consider Sunday on Saturday evening. Eat your cheese, Lady Helena." She ate her cheese. The gig made 48 miles in the first day. The second day it made 51. And the third afternoon, a man on a grey horse rode past them on the New Forest Road, and the man on the grey horse turned in his saddle to look at them as he passed. And Tristan, who had been telling Helena a story about a cook he had once shipped on a Bordeaux run, did not break the story, or alter his tone, or do anything in particular except shift the reins from his right hand to his left, so that his right hand was free. And the man on the grey horse, having considered the gig, and considered the brown-coated man, and considered the dark-haired widow, evidently decided he was looking for someone else, and rode on. When the grey horse was a quarter of a mile away, Tristan finished the story. "Was he?" Helena asked when he had finished. "He was. He decided we were not." "Why?" "Because your hair," Tristan said, "is 2 shades darker than the description he has from the Marquis, and because the brown coat is sufficiently undistinguished, and because the gig is the kind of gig in which the Marquis of Hawksbourne would on no account whatever be caught, alive or otherwise. He is looking for a black travelling carriage and a copper-haired woman in dark bronze silk." "I see." "And because," Tristan said, "you are eating an apple. The Marquis's betrothed, by his lordship's account, does not eat apples in a country gig. She rides in a closed carriage and weeps." "I do not weep." "You do not, Lady Helena, weep at all. I have," he added, "remarks it." She turned her face to him. "And you," she said, "find that remarkable?" "I find it," Tristan said, "useful." She was silent for the space of a hedge. "My governess," she said, "told me once that I did not weep because I had not been permitted to weep before I was old enough to wish to. She thought it a kind of damage." "Your governess," Tristan said, "was perhaps not as clever as she had supposed. The trick of not weeping at a thing is the chief equipment of survival. The sea was never sorry to see a man weep at her, but she never gave him an inch in return. "You speak of the sea," Helena said, "as if she were a person." "She is the only person," Tristan said, "to whom I have been faithful for 16 years. She looked at him sidelong. "That, Captain Rourke," she said, "was very nearly poetry." "It was an accident. It shall not recur." The corner of her mouth went up. He kept his eyes on the mare's ears. They were 3 miles short of Romsey when the wheel went. The wheel went because the axle of a country gig that has been used for the carrying of pigs to market is not the axle of a Bond Street brougham, and 3 days of chalk roads at a steady 8 miles to the hour will tell on a pig axle in a way a pig axle never would on a pig. The wheel went on a slow rise in a beechwood 1/2 a mile from the nearest dwelling. The mare, surprised, went 2 paces and stopped. The gig lurched and tilted, and the portmanteau slid into Helena's ankle, and she put her hand on Tristan's forearm to steady herself. Tristan, who had been raised to take notice of such things by way of catalogue, and not as a regular accountancy of the soul, took notice of the small, dry warmth of her gloved fingers through his coat sleeve, and registered the temperature in the precise, small, careful drawer of his mind, and went on registering it for some considerable distance after she had taken the hand away. "You said," Helena observed mildly, "Thursday." "I had hoped Friday. I revised to Thursday." He climbed down. He inspected the wheel. "It is gone," he said. "How gone?" "Sufficiently gone that the gig is, for our purposes, a chair on its side. Sufficiently gone that we shall not, this afternoon, complete the run to Lyme." Helena climbed down. Her boot touched the chalk. She held her hand up to the mare's nose, and the mare, who had warmed to her over 3 days, blew at her palm. "Then we mount the mare double," she said. "Yes." "How far?" 8 miles, to the 3 Crowns at Romsey. It is a tolerably respectable house. I shall hire us a chaise from there in the morning." "And tonight?" He looked at her. He had, for 3 days, slept in the back of the gig under his oilcloth. Helena had slept in the room of whatever inn they were stopped at, in a bed paid for separately, and the innkeeper had been told, on each occasion, that Mr. and Mrs. Hardy were on their way to Mrs. Hardy's sister in Devon, that Mrs. Hardy was tired, and that Mr. Hardy would sit up an hour by the fire and not disturb. It had been the arrangement. The arrangement, with 1 wheel of the gig in a beech wood and 8 miles to Romsey, and the late spring dusk coming down over the New Forest in long grey pieces, was about to revise itself. "Tonight," Tristan said, "we shall have to be a married couple. The 3 Crowns will not, this late on a Wednesday in the season, have 2 rooms." "I see." "I shall," Tristan said, "sleep on the floor." "Yes." "You shall," Tristan said, "have the bed." "Yes." "And the innkeeper at the 3 Crowns is an old acquaintance of the boatswain's, and the boatswain's word is good with him, and he will not inquire." "Very well, Captain Rourke." "Lady Helena, if you continue to call me Captain Rourke in the public room of the 3 Crowns, the innkeeper will be obliged to inquire." She considered. "Tristan," she said, experimentally. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. It hit him in a different place than the name Vane had hit him in the kitchen 4 nights previous. It hit him in the place where there had been, for some considerable time, a quiet, patient absence of being addressed by anyone in particular as Tristan. And the place answered, and Tristan stood very still and watched a piece of bark fall off the trunk of a beech, and listened, with a particular attention, to nothing at all. "Yes," he said. "Helena," she said. "Helena." He swung up onto the mare. He put down his hand. He pulled her up behind him in one motion. She had been right. She did not fall off. And she settled her hands at his waist, just above the belt, just below the ribs, because that was where one's hand settled at a canter behind a man one was not formally married to, in a beechwood at 6 in the evening in May. The mare, who had been bred for endurance, took the 8 miles to Romsey at a fair pace and never broke into a sweat. Tristan, who had been bred to no particular endurance at all, was sweating quietly inside the brown coat within the first half-mile. And he had not, for the first half-mile, the least notion why. The 3 Crowns gave them a small, clean room above the stable-yard, with a low ceiling and a window that opened onto the back garden, and a bed with a green and white counterpane, and a chair, and a small grate in which the chambermaid had laid a small hot fire, and the chambermaid had also laid out a basin and a towel and a cake of soap. And the chambermaid was an unimaginative woman of 38, who had laid out chambermaid's furniture for 14 years in this same room, and would not be unsettled by the sight of Mr. and Mrs. Hardy together in it for one night. The chambermaid went out and closed the door. The door fit badly in the jamb, and the latch settled into its keep with a small, chastened click, the sound of cheap ironwork too patient to complain. The fire in the grate caught the chair leg in a long, thin tongue of light, and pushed the shadow of the chair across the low ceiling in a slow, widening fan. Somewhere below them in the bar, a man laughed once at something another man had said, and the laugh was the comfortable laugh of a stranger who would never know what had been carried up his back stairs that hour, and the laugh settled the room more than the fire had. Outside the window, the stable-yard was very quiet. A horse, in the stall directly under the floorboards, shifted its weight from one back hoof to the other in a long, slow concession to the night, and the floorboards under Tristan's right boot answered with a small, sympathetic creak. Helena sat down on the edge of the bed. Tristan sat down on the chair. He had brought up, in his own arms, the small portmanteau, his sea-coat, and a wooden box containing 2 pistols, powder, and a small bag of ball. He set the box on the floor by the chair. He set the sea-coat folded over the arm of the chair. He looked at the green and white counterpane, and at the woman sitting on the edge of it. And the woman sitting on the edge of it looked at him. And the small, low room, with the small, hot fire, was very quiet. "You may have the bed," he said again. She thanked him quietly. He repeated that he should sleep on the floor. She said yes. "Do not," he said, "feel obliged to entertain me, Helena. I have spent worse nights on worse floors, and I am, as a rule, asleep within the minute." She said she was not, in any way she had been able to identify, feeling obliged to entertain him. "Then I shall," he said, "endeavor to be unentertaining." She told him, with the smallest possible adjustment of her mouth, that he was tolerably bad at it. He looked up. She had taken off her bonnet. She was sitting in her dark walnut hair and the borrowed black wool, and her face in the firelight was the face he had seen in the longboat, the face of a woman who had decided, in the half-second after a stranger had put his hand on her, that the stranger was not the thing she had to be afraid of. He felt the small, careful drawer of his mind open of its own accord again, and he set down inside it the third thing he had earned of her, which was that she had called him by his Christian name in a beechwood. He shut the drawer. He spoke briskly, laying out the next day for her as a man lays out cutlery for a dinner he intends to be done with. They should reach Lyme by sundown. Mrs. Charters would, if he was not mistaken, have the lugger lying at the Cobb with the crew assembled by Friday morning. She should be in Guernsey by Friday evening. She should be somewhere in the Channel Islands by Saturday. She should, at some point in the next month, be a free agent. She said yes to each of these. He observed, with great evenness of tone, that at the point of her becoming a free agent, she might proceed with the acquisition of her life. She agreed. It was, he said, the plan. It was, she said, the plan. He looked at her. "Sleep, Helena," he said. She bade him sleep, and used his Christian name a second time, very softly, in the small, low room above the stable-yard of the 3 Crowns at Romsey. She lay down on the bed in her dress, with the counterpane drawn up over her. He sat in the chair with the pistol box at his feet and the seacoat over his knees, and he stayed awake an hour, because that was the most he could decently do for her. And then he stretched out on the floor by the grate, with the seacoat for a pillow, and he slept the sleep of a man who has been 3 days on chalk roads in a country gig, with a woman he had pulled out of a fire. And he kept his eyes fixed on the grate, until the grate itself began to swim. In the morning the chaise was hired, the mare was tied behind it, the portmanteau was loaded, and they drove out of the 3 Crowns yard at 7:30, with a fresh pair of horses, and a sky the colour of dove-grey worsted. The road through the New Forest was an old road, and it had not, in many places, been mended since the war began. The chaise lurched at the dips, and stilled itself again on the flats. Tristan held the reins low at his thigh, and let the off-horse choose its line. Helena sat at his elbow, under the same dark cloak she had worn for 9 days, and watched the country go past her shoulder. The country was, in that last week of April and first week of May of 1814, a country that had been at war for the better part of her conscious life, and was only now beginning to remember itself in time of quiet. The hedges thick with sloe blossom, the verges full of red campion, and the first hot pink of campion that had not yet quite opened, the long, pale fields of new wheat between the woods. The smell of the lanes was the smell of hawthorn, and under the hawthorn, the smell of last year's leaves rotting in the ditch, and under that, the cold, mineral smell of the chalk under everything. She had ridden through this country once before, in a closed carriage, at the age of 22, beside her father, on the way to a house in Hampshire that had since been sold to settle a different debt. She had seen, that day, none of it. The closed carriage had taught her, over 11 years, to see the country only as a thing one was being carried through. The open chaise, with Tristan's brown sleeve at her elbow and the chestnut mare's tail flick visible above the splashboard, was teaching her, by the half hour, the opposite lesson. She did not say any of this. She filed it. She had been, for 11 years, the kind of woman who filed things. The new habit she was learning, by the half hour, on the road to Lyne, was the habit of taking the filed things out again at her own choice. By dusk, they were at the top of the hill above Lyne. The town fell away beneath them in tiles and chimneys, and the long pale curve of the Cobb, running out into a sea that was, in the May twilight, the colour of pewter under a high, cloudless lid. The lugger was at the Cobb. Tristan saw her from the top of the hill, a small, dark-hulled Guernsey boat with a tan mainsail furled, and a deck the length of a small drawing-room. And he felt, looking at her, the particular kind of pang a man feels when he sees a vessel he has not yet boarded that will, within the day, carry off something he has come to think of as a thing he had been keeping. He shut the pang in the small, careful drawer. He drove down into the town. Mrs. Charters of the Cobb Chandlery was a woman of 43 years and 1 good eye, who had buried 2 husbands and refused a third, and who kept her business in a narrow stone-fronted house on Bridge Street, and her opinions in a smaller compass than her business. She received Tristan in her back parlour, looked at Helena with one shrewd, assessing pass of the good eye, listened to the matter in 7 sentences, and put down her tea. "Friday morning at the Slack," she said. 5 o'clock. The lugger will be at the second bollard from the end. Captain Lebrun has the helm. Captain Lebrun will not require your name, ma'am. Captain Lebrun has not, in 11 years, required any lady's name. You may carry whatever you carry. Mr. Rourke will, I expect, deliver you to the bollard." "He will," Helena said. "Then we are agreed." "Mrs. Charters," Tristan said. "Mr. Rourke." "I am obliged." "You are not, Mr. Rourke, in any way obliged. I have been waiting 4 years for an occasion to be of use to you, of a magnitude commensurate with the occasion at which you were of use to me. You will not, I imagine, recognize the magnitude. I do. We are square. Mrs. Charters, Mr. Rourke. Good night, ma'am." "Good night, Mrs. Charters," Helena said. They walked back along Bridge Street in the dusk to the inn Mrs. Charters had recommended, which was the Royal Lion, and which was at the top of the town and quiet. Tristan took 2 rooms. The innkeeper at the Royal Lion did not inquire. Tristan saw Helena into her room. He stood on the landing outside her door for the space of 2 slow breaths after she had closed it, and then he went into his own room and shut his own door, and stood with his back to it and his hand on the latch for the space of 3 further breaths. The mare was in the stable. The pistols were in the wardrobe. The plan was in motion. Friday morning at 5 o'clock, at the second bollard from the end of the cob. "Damn me," he said aloud to the empty room, very quietly, with the precise informality of a man who almost never swore. He sat down on the edge of his bed and put his face in his hands and considered, for the first time in the 8 days since he had pulled Helena Vane off the foredeck of the Halcyon, the question of what he proposed to do at 5 3 past 5 o'clock on Friday morning, after the lugger had cleared the bollards. He had no answer. He had no plan. The drawer in his mind, which had been so careful and so small, was full. He sat with his face in his hands in a room above the bar of the Royal Lion in Lyme Regis, on a Thursday night in May of 1814, with a brace of pistols in the wardrobe, and a woman next door whom he had no right whatever to be in love with, and was, by his own quiet best estimate, in love with anyway. He sat there a long time. He went down to the bar at last. He had 2 glasses of porter, and not a third. He listened, with one ear, to the conversation in the bar, which was about the price of mackerel and a wrestling match at Bridport, and a young curate at Charmouth who had been preaching against the use of horsehair upholstery on theological grounds. He paid for his porter. He went up to bed. He passed Helena's door on the landing. There was no light under it. He went into his own room. He locked the door. He slept 4 hours and dreamed twice that the Halcyon was burning, and once that the lugger had sailed without him aboard, and once that he was, very inexplicably, in a withdrawing room in Mayfair with his mother, who had been gone from him 19 years, and his mother was setting out tea on a tray and telling him, in her own voice, that he had been an extremely foolish boy. But she was pleased with him anyway. He woke at 4. He dressed. He shaved by the light of 1 candle. He went down to the stable yard. He saddled the mare. He went up the back stairs to Helena's room. He knocked very lightly. He called her name very softly at the door. She answered from inside that she was awake. He told her, through the wood, that it was 4 o'clock and they had an hour. She said she was ready. She opened the door. She was in the black wool. Her hair was pinned plainly under a dark bonnet. The portmanteau was at her feet. Her face was the face of a woman who had not slept and had not expected to. "Come," he said. They went down the back stairs and into the stable yard. The mare was tied to the ring. The chaise had been kept overnight by Tristan's express bribe of the ostler, and was waiting in the yard with a pair of fresh horses. The yard was quiet. The town was quiet. A single lantern burned over the door of the innkeeper's pantry. They were halfway across the yard when the back gate opened. Tristan turned. His right hand moved by long habit to the small of his back where, on board, a man kept a hanger. He carried this morning no hanger. He carried a pistol in the breast pocket of the brown coat, with the powder dry and the ball home, because he was a man who travelled prepared, and not, by any disposition, a man who travelled willing. In the gate stood a tall man in a black many-caped coat. Behind the tall man, in the lane, 4 horses and 3 more men. The tall man's hair, even by the light of the innkeeper's lantern, was the colour of unblacked steel. His face was beautiful, the very particular cold beauty of a portrait one stops in a gallery to look at twice, and walks away from with the impression of having been measured. He was 30 years old. He was the Marquis of Hawksbourne. He looked across the yard at Tristan, and at Helena beside Tristan, and at the portmanteau in Helena's hand. He looked for the space of one slow breath. He took off his hat. "Lady Helena," he said. His voice was very low. It had the careful, periphrastic precision of a man who had never in his life raised it to be heard. "My lord," Helena said. She put down the portmanteau. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She stood, very straight, in the middle of the Royal Lion's stable yard, and she set her left hand at her side and her right hand, gloved, in the pocket of the black wool cloak. The Marquis of Hawksbourne stepped into the yard. The 4 men in the lane did not follow him. They stayed in the lane. One of them, in the foreground, set his hand on the reins of the Marquis's bay. The bay shifted and was steady. "You will be obliged, my lord," Tristan said quietly, "to take one further step before I shall feel obliged to inconvenience you." The Marquis's eyes moved to him. "Mr. Rourke," the Marquis said. "Captain Rourke, if you please, my lord." "Captain Rourke, I had been informed that the cutter Halcyon was at the bottom of the channel." "She is." "Then the courtesy of the title is, I confess, opaque to me. But I shall extend it. Captain Rourke. A cutter captain put ashore without his cutter is a man whose movements one may, with a little patience, predict. The chandleries of the south coast are not, in their number, infinite. The chandlery of one Mrs. Charters of Lyme is, by reputation, the chandlery a man in your particular present circumstances would call upon. I called upon Mrs. Charters' near neighbour yesterday at dusk, and was, at modest expense, informed that a brown-coated gentleman and a dark-haired lady had crossed Bridge Street toward the Royal Lion an hour previous. I am here on a small private matter that does not, I assure you, concern your person. I shall be obliged to escort Lady Helena to my carriage. The carriage is in the High Street. The journey will be brief. There will be no scene." "My lord." "Yes, Captain Rourke. There will be a scene." The Marquis of Hawksbourne tilted his head a quarter of an inch to the side. It was the only motion any part of him made. "I confess myself surprised," he said. "I imagine you are. Captain Rourke, you are, by your father's misfortunes and your uncle's prudence, no man of property. Lady Helena is contracted to me by deed and by signature. The deed is sound. The signature is her father's. You will pardon my plainness. You have no standing whatever in this yard." "None whatever, my lord," Tristan said. "I have, however, a brace of pistols, 4 good lungs, and a quarrel that begins about an hour after my father took to your father's apple tree in the year 3. I shall be content to settle the quarrel here. I shall also be content," he said, "to settle it before a magistrate. You shall choose, my lord." The Marquis looked, for the first time, very nearly amused. "That is a great deal of theatre, Captain Rourke, for a yard." "It is the only yard, my lord, I have to hand." "Cassian!" It was Helena. Her voice was perfectly even. She had not moved at all. The Marquis turned his eyes to her. "My lady." "Cassian," she said again, and the use of his name in her mouth was the first thing that had altered him in the conversation. A small contraction of the muscles around the mouth, the smallest possible thing. "Cassian, you will not take me to the carriage." "I shall, my lady. I am sorry." "You will not, Cassian, take me to the carriage, because I am not, in this matter, the property of any party. I am the daughter of a man who signed a deed against me when I was a child of 13. And I have spent 11 years finding the means of correcting his act in my own person. I am, this morning, in the act of correcting it. You will be obliged," she said, in a voice that had grown, sentence by sentence, very quiet and very firm, "to let me proceed. My lady, the deed. The deed was signed by my father. I shall return it. I shall return it on a quarter day. I shall return Vane Manor at its present valuation and the rent of the Hampshire farms over 14 years, and the consideration in coin advanced to my father in the year 3. I shall return the lot. With, she said, interest at 4% compounded. It is calculated. I shall present the calculation in writing this day. I shall present the means of the repayment over 7 years. I have the means. I have lived in your house, my lord, since I was 13. I have, Helena said, kept accounts. The Marquis of Hawksbourne did not speak immediately. A pigeon on the roof of the innkeeper's pantry walked 3 steps along the lead flashing and stopped. You have, the Marquis said at last, kept accounts. For 11 years, my lord, in a small ledger in the lower drawer of the writing desk in the green room. The writing desk you provided me yourself. Lady Helena. My lord. It does not occur to you, the Marquis said, that the deed is the matter and not the calculation. It occurs to me, Helena said, that you are a methodical man, and that you have, in 11 years, been bored by the deed. The calculation will give you, I think, more pleasure than the deed has. It will, in any case, give you the principal restored. The honour of the House of Daventry will not require, for its restoration, the personal attendance of my body at Hawksbourne House. The calculation will do. The Marquis of Hawksbourne looked at her. He looked at her, that morning in the Royal Lion's Yard, with the expression of a man who has been served, after a long, quiet meal, an unexpected dish, and does not yet know whether to send it back. His face, that particular cold beauty, went through some small, unreadable adjustment. It does not become you, he said softly, to bargain. It does not become me, my lord, to be sold. He was silent. Cassian, she said, and her use of the name was the second instance, and it landed harder than the first. I knew your mother. You did. She was good to me when I was 13 and she was failing. She came up to the schoolroom 3 times. She brought me a small enamelled compass that had been her own mother's. I have it still. I should be obliged, Helena said, if you would consult, at your earliest leisure, your own memory of her, and ask yourself if she would have approved of the deed. The Marquis of Hawksbourne did not move. He did not move for the space of perhaps half a minute. Tristan, on Helena's left, did not move either. The pigeon on the lead flashing did not move. The 4 men in the lane did not move. The bay in the lane shifted its weight from one back hoof to the other, and was still. Mr. Rourke, the Marquis said, without taking his eyes off Helena. My lord. Inside the house, in the public room of the Royal Lion, there is, at this hour, a deal table by the fire. There is, on the deal table, by my arrangement with the innkeeper, an inkstand. There is, in the inside breast pocket of my coat, the deed in question. Lady Helena will be obliged, he said, to come inside with me. So shall you. There will not be a scene. There will be, he said, a piece of writing. He took the deed from his breast pocket. He held it in his hand, in the lantern light of the Royal Lion's Yard, and the deed was a folded paper of perhaps 4 pages, sealed with 2 seals, and the seals were unbroken. My lord, Tristan said. Captain Rourke? The deed is to be signed in Lady Helena's presence, not in another room, not by an agent, not in your lordship's hand alone. Captain Rourke, I had not proposed it should be. You will, Tristan said, forgive my precision. I find your precision, the Marquis said, wearying, but I do not find it objectionable. Come inside. They went inside. The innkeeper, who was Mrs. Charters's cousin, opened the door without speaking. The public room was empty at that hour, but for one old man asleep in the corner under a tankard. The fire had been laid. The deal table by the fire had, indeed, an inkstand on it. The Marquis sat down. He laid the deed on the table. He drew across it the inkstand. He took out, from another pocket, a quill case. He laid the quill on the table. He looked up at Helena. "Lady Helena," he said.
"My lord. You will, before I sign, oblige me by stating, in this room, in the presence of Captain Rourke and the innkeeper, that you are in this matter under no duress from any party." "I am under no duress," Helena said, "from any party. I act of my own intention."
"And the calculation," the Marquis said, "you will provide by Michaelmas."
"By Michaelmas."
"In your own hand?"
"In my own hand."
"And the first instalment by Lady Day?"
"By Lady Day."
He dipped the quill. He wrote, on the deed, in a small, precise hand at the foot of the 4th page. Helena bent her head and read the line as he wrote it. The line, in the careful Daventry script, read, "I, Cassian Daventry, 5th Marquis of Hawksbourne, in lieu of the personal performance of the contract above, and against the considerations set out by Lady Helena Vane in my presence this day, do hereby withdraw and discharge the said Lady Helena from all claim, present or future, of my person or my house."
He signed his name beneath it. He pressed his signet ring into the wax beside it. He set down the quill. He looked at Helena, across the deal table by the fire of the Royal Lion in Lyme Regis, at 23 minutes past 4 on a Friday morning in May of 1814. "I had loved you, in some measure," he said, in the same very low voice. "I did not know how to put it down." "My lord," Helena said, "I am putting it down. I am Cassian. I am sorry." "You are not Lady Helena to be sorry. I am to be sorry." He looked at the deed, the way a man looks at a piece of his own work he has not, in the moment of finishing it, fully understood. "My mother," he said, "would not, in fact, have approved. You are correct. I shall consult her memory at my leisure. Goodbye, Lady Helena." "Goodbye, my lord." He rose. He bowed. He took his hat from the deal table. He walked out of the Royal Lion's public room, and out of the inn, and into the lane, and the 4 men in the lane mounted, and the Marquis mounted, and the bay turned in the lane and went up the high street at a walk, and the sound of the bay's hooves on the cobbles grew small and was gone. The innkeeper, who had been standing in the door of the pantry the entire time, came out and took the deed, and folded it, and handed it to Helena. And Helena took it, and held it in her gloved hand, and she did not look at it. She looked at Tristan. "Captain Rourke," she said. "Helena. There is, by the innkeeper's clock, 28 minutes until the lugger sails." "There is." "I find," she said slowly, "that I am no longer in any particular need of the lugger." "You are not." "I find," she said, "that I am, on the contrary, in some particular need of the chaise we hired in Romsey yesterday, the mare in the stable, the brown coat on your back, and one small enamelled compass that has a crack across the face, but still finds north. I find," she said, "that I am, this morning, very nearly an entirely free agent, for the first time in 11 years, and that I am, on inquiry, not in any particular hurry to be at Guernsey. I find," she said, and her voice had the quietest possible trembling in it, the kind a listener 3 feet away would have heard, "that what I should chiefly like to do, this morning, is take the chaise from Lyme to somewhere on the coast that I have not seen, with a man who does not, by any present reckoning, owe me anything whatever, and see what the country looks like in the light." Tristan stood across the deal table from her, with the dawn in the public room window, and the fire warm at his hip, and the deed folded in her hand. And he understood, very simply and all at once, that the small, careful drawer of his mind had been the wrong size for what he had been trying to keep in it, and that the drawer would not, after this morning, suffice. "Helena," he said, Yes. I have, he said, a small farmhouse on a lease in Devon. The lease has 11 years to run. The house has a slate roof and 3 rooms, and a kitchen and a garden and a view of the sea from the upper window. I had been keeping the lease against the day my ship went down. The ship has, as you know, gone down. I should be obliged, he said, if you would consider whether the country you would chiefly like to see in the light might not, by some accident of geography, be the country in front of that upper window. Tristan. Yes. You are proposing, she said, that I move into your farmhouse. I am proposing, he said, that you consider it. You are, by your own statement of this minute, very nearly a free agent for the first time in 11 years. I shall not impose. You are not imposing. I am offering, he said, a slate roof and a view and a garden and the use by daylight of a kitchen. I am not, this morning, offering anything else. And by night? Captain Rourke. By night, Tristan said, I shall sleep in the kitchen with the door shut until you have, at your own pace and in your own hand, decided what you should chiefly like to do. She came round the deal table. She came round it without hurry. She stopped a foot from him. She set the folded deed down on the deal table behind her. She set her gloved right hand, very lightly, on the lapel of the brown coat. She looked up at him. Her dark walnut hair had begun, where the bonnet sat on it, to lighten. The walnut, 4 days old, was wearing off, and a thin line of copper had returned at the temple. Tristan Rourke, she said. Helena Vane. I have, she said, spent 11 years arranging an objection. I know. I have, she said, no further objections. Helena. Yes. I love you, he said. It came out quite simply. He had not been certain, 2 minutes earlier, that the sentence was the kind of sentence he produced at all. He produced it. He set it on the air between them, the way a man might set down a small enamelled compass on a table. I have, since the longboat. I shall, in all probability, for the foreseeable. You may take it or set it down. You are free, this morning, to do either. I shall take it, Tristan, Helena said. Yes. I love you, she said. I have, since the bread. I think it began about the time you said cheese had been going out of fashion at sea for 16 years. I think it confirmed itself when you would not call my compass broken. I think it set itself permanently somewhere on the New Forest Road, when, on being touched on the sleeve, you took notice of the touch, in no way other than to be very still about it for 1/4 of a mile. I shall take, she said, your slate roof, and your garden, and your view, and your kitchen by day, and your bed when I shall be ready, and your name when I shall be readier still. I shall not, in any case, be at Guernsey on Friday morning. No. No. He kissed her. He kissed her in the public room of the Royal Lion at 26 minutes past 4 on a Friday morning in May, with the innkeeper at the pantry door very respectfully not looking, and the old man asleep in the corner under the tankard, and the dawn, the colour of a peach over the slate roofs of lime. He kissed her once. He kissed her twice. He set his forehead against her forehead. He held the back of her dark walnut head in his right hand, and he felt the line of copper at her temple under his thumb. And he thought, briefly, of his mother in the dream, setting out tea on a tray. The chaise, he said. Yes. Lyme is east of Devon. It is. We shall make it by sundown. We shall. He picked up the deed off the deal table behind her. He folded it again. He put it inside the inside breast pocket of the brown coat. He took her gloved hand. He walked her out of the public room of the Royal Lion. He paid the innkeeper. He nodded to Mrs. Charters's cousin. He helped Helena up into the chaise. He tied the mare behind. He took the reins. He turned the chaise out of the yard and into the high street and east along the coast road, and the sun, when it came up at 5:15, came up at their backs and put their shadow in front of them on the chalk for half a mile. They did not speak much on the road east out of Lyme. Tristan held the reins. Helena watched the country. Once they passed a low stone bridge over a brook in which a small grey heron was standing in 3 inches of water, with its head cocked at an angle that suggested it had been there for half the morning and intended to remain another half. Helena set her hand for a half instant on Tristan's forearm in passing, the way she had set it the day the wheel went. He did not turn his head, but the small, precise drawer of his mind, by now considerably overflowed, accepted the touch and held it. Once a south wind came up and brought, off the sea on their right, the smell of salt and weed and tar, and the particular other smell of a particular kind of small port that had begun, after the burning of the halcyon, to be the smell that meant the halcyon was gone. He felt the smell go through him without pain. He folded the smell away. The mare's hooves on the chalk made a sound he had been hearing for 16 days, and would, by his own quiet best estimate, be hearing for the rest of his life. They came into the small village of Branscombe at 6. The inn there had a yard, and the yard had a horse trough, and the trough had a slow stone tap above it that ran continuously into a bed of watercress at the foot. They watered the mare. They bought a meat pie and a pint of cider, and shared the pie at a bench under the wall. Helena ate her half with great steady appetite. Tristan watched her eat the half and made no observation, because he was a man who had decided, that morning in the Royal Lion's Yard, that he would not observe his wife when she was eating in a yard, and would observe her instead at a great many other times of his own choosing. Helena, who was not yet his wife, but was, by ordinary working definition, 3 days from being his wife, ate her half of the pie and her share of the cider, and stood and brushed the crumbs from the borrowed black wool and said, "On, Captain Rourke." "On, Lady Helena." "Mrs. Hardy this evening, I believe." "Mrs. Hardy this evening. Mrs. Rourke by the end of next week, with luck and a curate of accommodating spirit." "Mrs. Rourke." "I shall write to the curate at Salcombe tomorrow." "Do." They climbed back into the chaise. The mare, refreshed by the watercress water and a single slow apple Helena had carried in her pocket from Lyme, made the last 12 miles before sundown in good time. They turned off the coast road at Beer onto the small white lane that climbed the cliff and rolled 3 miles inland between 2 thorn hedges, and dropped, by way of a paddock and a small stand of beach, into a small fold of land at the back of which sat, on a slate-roofed foundation that had been laid by a fisherman in the year 1771, the small farmhouse Tristan had been keeping against the day his ship went down. The ship had gone down. He drew up the chaise in the yard. He got down. He went round to Helena's side. He held up his hand. He helped her down. Her boots touched the chalk of his own farmyard. She stood there a moment. She looked at the slate roof. She looked at the small green door. She looked at the upper window, which was set in the south wall under the eaves and showed, even at this distance, a square of the same dark pewter sea they had been driving along all afternoon. She looked at the bay tree, which was not at that point a bay tree, but a small empty patch of earth by the gate. She looked at the hens, which were not yet hens, but a small unfilled house against the south wall. "Well, Captain Rourke," she said. "Well, Lady Helena." "It is a slate roof." "It is a slate roof." "And a garden." "And a garden." "And, I am to understand, a view from the upper window." "On a clear day, the chalk headland east of the cove." "And a kitchen by day." "By day." "Captain Rourke." "Yes." "It is the country I should chiefly like to see in the light." The curate at Salcombe was, in the event, accommodating. The banns were read. The marriage was performed in a small chapel of grey stone on the 3rd Saturday of June, 1814, in the presence of Mrs. Penny and her husband, who had been brought down from Sussex by carrier for the purpose, and the boatswain, who had walked from Lyme, and Mrs. Charters of the Cobb, Chandlery, who had brought a wedding gift of a brass-cased ship's clock that struck 8 bells at the half-hours and chimed 7 minutes fast for the rest of its life. Helena wore a plain gown of pale dove-grey muslin and a sprig of late lavender in her hair. Tristan wore the brown coat. The curate, whose name was Hardcastle, pronounced them, in his own opinion, the calmest pair of newly married persons he had ever pronounced. They walked back from the chapel along the coast path under a sky the colour of a peach. "You may now kiss the bride," the curate Hardcastle said, who had a slight lisp on the soft consonants, and pronounced it Brythe. Tristan kissed the bride. The bride kissed Tristan. Mrs. Penny wept twice, and Mrs. Charters wept once, very dryly, into a handkerchief she had brought for the purpose. By August, they had been married 7 weeks. By the August of the following year, 14 months on from the morning at the Royal Lion, they had been married a year and 3 months, and there were, in the small farmhouse with the slate roof, 4 hens, 2 rows of beans, a thicket of late peas, a small bay tree by the gate, a small enamelled compass on the kitchen window-sill, and a small daughter named Margaret Eleanor Rourke, who was 11 weeks old and slept, on this particular Tuesday morning in August, in a basket on a folded shawl on the warm flagstones of the back garden. The woman who had been pulled off the burning deck of the cutter Halcyon at 3 bells of the middle watch on a Wednesday night in March of 1814 was, this Tuesday morning in August of 1815, sitting on a flat, sun-warm stone in a faded blue gown, mending the hem of a child's shift she had cut from an old apron. The shift was the size of a small kitchen cat. The child it had been cut for was, at this exact instant, asleep on a folded shawl in a basket 2 feet from the woman's left ankle, with one fist closed in the air above her own head and her face turned to the wall of the cottage that had been warmed by the morning sun. The woman was Helena Rourke, born Vane. The cottage was on a lease that had 10 years and 4 months still to run. The slate roof was sound. The view of the sea from the upper window included, on a clear day, the long pale line of a chalk headland to the east, and on this morning the day was clear. The garden contained 4 hens, 2 rows of beans, a thicket of late peas, a small bay tree planted at the gate by Helena's own hand the May after they had taken possession, and a small folded enamelled compass in its velvet writing case, set on the kitchen window-sill of the cottage, where Helena could see at any time she chose to lift her head. She lifted her head. The compass was where she had left it. Tristan Rourke was at the bottom of the garden, in a brown linen shirt and an old pair of duck trousers, mending the gate. He had been mending the gate for 37 minutes. He had been mending it, by his own admission, badly. He set down the hammer and stepped back and looked at the gate, and put one hand on the back of his neck. And Helena watched him over the top of the small shift and the small basket, and she thought, as she had thought every morning for 14 months, that the country she had chiefly wanted to see in the light was, in fact, in front of her, and was largely composed of a slate roof, 4 hens, a bad gate, and a man at the bottom of a garden who had pulled her, on a March night in 1814, off a burning deck. "Tristan," she called. "Helena." "The gate." "I am aware of the gate." "It is not by any reasonable lights a gate." "It is a gate," he said, "in progress." "It has been," she said, "in progress for 37 minutes." "I am unfamiliar," Tristan said, with great dignity, "with the species. I have spent 16 years, he said, putting iron rings into rock for the mooring of small craft. The gate is, by comparison, an unfamiliar species. I shall come up. I shall consult my wife. I shall, he said, begin again. He came up the garden. He stopped by the flat stone. He looked at the small shift in his wife's hands. He looked at the small basket. He bent and put one finger, very lightly, against the small, closed fist in the air above the small head, and the small fist opened and closed again, of its own accord, on the finger. "She has," Helena said quietly, "your reach." "She has," Tristan said, "her mother's good sense to grip when she is offered." He straightened. He stood with his hand on the back of his neck. He looked east, along the coast, at the long, pale chalk headland, a clear 3 miles away. "Helena." "Yes?" "There was, this morning, a letter from Bath." "Lady Pendarves?" "Lady Pendarves. She writes that she has been, by the agency of common acquaintances, informed of our daughter. She writes that she would be glad to be presented. She writes that she would, in fact, be glad to be presented before Christmas. She writes," Tristan said, "in her own hand." "Then you shall reply, Tristan, in your own hand." "I shall reply." "And we shall go, in October, by chaise." "By chaise." He picked up the hammer from the grass at his foot. "And the deed of withdrawal," he said, "is still in the writing desk in the parlour." "With the calculation." "With the calculation." "And the first instalment." "Paid at Lady Day." "Tristan, you know it was." "I know it was," Tristan said. "I am only saying it because the saying of it gives me pleasure." "You are a vain man, Captain Rourke." "I am, Mrs. Rourke." He bent and kissed his wife on the top of her head, where the copper had been 4 months coming back through the walnut, and was, this August, the colour of copper just out of the smith's water bath again. He set his hand for 1/2 instant on the side of the small basket. He went back down the garden to the gate. Helena watched him go. She watched him stop at the gate. She watched him look at the gate. She watched him pick up the hammer in his right hand and the gate stile in his left, and consider the gate again from this new angle, and lay the gate stile against the post, and tap very tentatively at the gate stile with the hammer. And she watched the gate stile slide 1/4 of an inch out of true under the tap, and Tristan close his eyes for a moment of patient theological consideration, and reach for the gate stile again. The hen in the lavender by the gatepost stepped on a clod of earth, and was unsurprised. The sea, beyond the garden wall, came up and ran down again on the shingle of the small cove below the cottage, the way it had come up and run down on a particular shingle 8 miles west, on a particular March night, on which a particular cutter named the Halcyon had given a great soft sigh of a sound, and broken her own back, and let her orange light go out across a particular woman's face. Helena lifted the small shift to the morning sun and held it at arm's length to look at the line of the hem. The hem was, by her own honest reckoning, only a small degree better than the gate. She went on stitching. In the basket at her ankle, the small daughter she and Tristan had named Margaret, after his mother, and Eleanor, after hers, slept on with one small fist still in the air above her head, and the small fist opened, of its own accord, and closed again on a particular nothing the small daughter had not yet learned that she was holding. "Tristan," Helena said when the small fist had closed. "Helena, come and see." He came up the garden again. He looked into the basket. He looked at his wife on the stone. He sat down on the grass at her feet, hammer beside him, brown linen shirt rolled to the elbow, and he leaned his shoulder against her knee, and he said, "I am here." "You are here," Helena said. The compass, on the kitchen windowsill, found north of its own accord, the way it had been finding north for 91 years. The hen in the lavender pecked once at the clod and walked on. "Helena," Tristan said. "Yes?" "The gate." "You shall, Captain Rourke, finish the gate." "I shall, Mrs. Rourke, after luncheon." "After luncheon." "In my own hand." in your own hand. The morning sun on the slate roof of the cottage was the color of bread.